Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Northern Broadcasting Service. In this episode, we will have a special interview with the South Pacific's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Omega. Omega, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start off with, tell us a little bit about the South Pacific.
Yeah, so as everyone is probably well aware, the South Pacific is one of the 5 feeder regions of nation states, and it's the oldest democratic region within nation states, a tradition we're really quite proud of. TSP has a vibrant culture centered around our unofficial island-based theme, where when you come to TSP, I'm sure right away you'll be offered a glass of spit, a lampshade, and be welcomed right on into the community.
A glass of spit?
South Pacific iced tea, that would happen to be our official regional beverage. It's an alcoholic beverage that's a variation on Long Island iced tea, just it uses, I'm going to mispronounce this, blue curacao, I think, in order to make it blue. I've never had it, but I know that our Prime Minister Rovan has had it with a couple other TSPers when they did a little meetup IRL.
That definitely sounds interesting.
I'm told it's delightful. So,
as one of the feeder regions for the game, what has been the biggest challenge in recent history for the South Pacific?
Well, it really depends on what you mean by recent. If you mean in the last 5 years, it would be the 2016 Highville coup. But if you mean in the last year or so, I think probably the biggest thing the South Pacific has really been trying to do is get our delegate endorsement numbers higher. That's something that's really difficult for any region to do, especially a feeder where you just have countless nations streaming in every day. Luckily, through the Southern World Assembly Initiative, or SWAN, we've had a lot of success in getting Sumerian's endorsement count up to be over 1,000 endorsements, something we're personally really proud of, and has really helped us overcome one of the major challenges a lot of feeder regions tend to face.
So you mentioned your delegate and getting their endorsement count up. How exactly is the government of the South Pacific set up?
Well, you cut out there, but I'm going to guess you're asking what the government is doing in order to do that. Really, it's largely a technical project, aided by Vietnam and Rovan, who did a lot of the coding for it. It basically just allows us to create what word do I want to use here? Incentives to endorse everybody in the region, to endorse all the members of our council on regional security, to endorse the delegate, just so that way we can ensure that the South Pacific is protected from any threat that may arise, be it internal or external.
So you mentioned the delegate and regional security officers. How is the government of the South Pacific set up?
So the government of the South Pacific is set up in a head of state, head of government system. So we have our head of state, who is the delegate, who is a largely ceremonial figurehead, but does a lot for our gameside community. The gameside community is also served by the local council, who is elected exclusively by the gameside community. And they basically act as our regional message board moderators and have the authority to pursue their own initiatives for the gameside. On the other side of the community, kind of the forum side of the community, we have our head of government, who is the prime minister, who leads the cabinet, and all of the members of the cabinet are elected individually, so they're not appointed by the prime minister. So Rovan was elected by the region. I was also elected by the region. Jay was also elected by the region. And Warrior, who's our minister of military affairs, was also elected by the region. So we don't necessarily have a prime minister who's able to just say, okay, I'm prime minister, here's who I want my cabinet to be. The region kind of dictates that, and it gives me a lot more autonomy to pursue a foreign policy that I would want to pursue, even if it were to come into contact with the prime minister. However, to be clear, the prime minister and I talk a lot about foreign policy, and I'm sure to coordinate our foreign policy with both the desires of the region and the prime minister. And so there's 2 more pieces of our government. Of course, there's the high court, which is our judicial branch, which is a pretty standard judicial branch. We also have the assembly, where if you're a citizen of the South Pacific, or a resident, as most other regions would call it, we call them citizens, you can apply to become a legislator within the assembly, which allows you to vote on all laws and amendments to our charter, and some appointments require confirmation votes. It allows you to vote on those, and treaties. It's really just a great body that allows us to find solutions to the problems we think are facing the region.
So you mentioned that as an elected foreign affairs minister, that you're able to pursue a foreign affairs in the way you see fit. Recently, you introduced a debate within your region to reorganize part of your ministry into separate ministries. What led to that decision?
Yeah, so let me take off my cabinet hat here, because I'm not doing that as a cabinet minister. When I'm starting a debate in the assembly on any matter not related to foreign policy, I'm doing that as a legislator, not as Minister of Foreign Affairs. So in starting that doing it simply, and just for some context, back in December of last year, the region had a discussion on whether or not we would want to split apart the Ministry of Regional Affairs. The Ministry of Regional Affairs is in charge of event, a terrific job with it. They help foster our role play community within the South Pacific, something that Jay, before he was elected minister, just shined in doing. And we now have a much more community thanks to the work of the Ministry of Regional Affairs. And they also work on our government-sponsored media operations. So while there is a history of independent media within the South Pacific, the Southern Journal, our primary publication, is really the cornerstone of media. The Ministry of Regional Affairs is primarily responsible. However, that's a lot in one portfolio, and they also have integration within that portfolio. So it's really kind of unwieldy for one minister, my opinion. That's why I introduced the initial legislation and restarted that debate on whether or not it was proper to split. Now, anyone who knows about South Pacific politics, that debate has become quite heated. Frankly,
You're breaking up there.
We really are all trying to do what's best for the region. But I think it's good that we're having that debate. I just regret the way in which that debate has been conducted. Oh, and the reason I started it, wanted to be clear, because we're coming up on elections. Elections will start on the 1st of June. So it's just, if we're going to change the structure of the ministries, now would be the time to do it.
Going back to your foreign affairs hat, the South Pacific entered into a treaty with the Pacific. What led to that treaty?
Yeah, so Pax Capricorn is not a full-fledged mutual defense treaty. It is simply a aggression between our two regions. That agreement was initiated after we had renormalized relations at the start of my first term as Minister of Foreign Affairs by rebuilding our embassy with the Pacific. Frankly, we've been really encouraged by a lot of the reforms we saw within the New Pacific Order when Lord of Darkness became Emperor. And we previously had a full-on mutual defense, so an effort to kind of begin the rekindling of that prosperous relationship between our two regions. We thought it would be prudent in order to pursue a non-aggression pact. Now, the non-aggression pact does have a sunset clause in it. Without divulging too much about, that was something that the South Pacific.
You're breaking up on that answer right there.
Oh, my apologies. We do have a sunset non-aggression pact, which requires us to review it every 12 months. And that was something that the public had wanted to see with the agreement, and it allows us to ensure that we're seeing the friendship develop how we want to, and that both sides are still upholding what they want, and it allows us to once a year recommit ourselves to this with the New Pacific Order and ensure that it's still a foreign policy public within want to pursue, because that reauthorization does an assembly vote on basically re-ratification non-aggression before the general public of the South Pacific to have that oversight of the foreign affairs policy that is laid out by the minister.
So Since we're talking about non-aggression pacts, let's talk about the South Pacific's military. Recently, the South Pacific moved their military operations into a pure defender-only ops. How does this further the South Pacific interest on the national stage?
Well, let me start by making one thing clear about that move is that's a move that really just reflected where the South Pacific was at the time. It wasn't a change in regional culture because the South Pacific had already been functionally defender for a while. And so when we made that move, it was more of we are accepting our identity as place in regards to that. What that has allowed us to do is it allows us to really engage with some of the other defender regions. One of the first things that happened as a result of the resolution adopting the military ideology was we actually signed full-on treaty with a now close ally in 10,000 Islands. And we would not have been able to do that without that defender alignment switch. And to best speak on behalf of the South Pacific Special Forces and what they do militarily, but I know that by switching over to be full defender, as opposed to simply being non-aligned, has really allowed them to exhibit more leadership within the defender sphere.
Do you think that the South Pacific being defender only emboldens hostile regions to act against South Pacific interest?
I really don't think it has. I think by switching over to be defender, we've finally made it clear that this is where the South Pacific was, because there was a de facto feeling within gameplay that the South Pacific was defender for years, ever since I started playing the game back in 2015. And that feeling has really made it difficult to kind of conduct relations with some other non-aligned regions. So by finally coming out and saying we are a defender, it's become clear where the South Pacific stands in the world and has allowed us to have better relations with people because they're not doubting, are you really non-aligned or are you pretending to be non-aligned? Now it's clear we are a defender, and that's allowed us to start to become more connected with those who may not necessarily be defender, but just wanting to know where we.
All right, let's go into a broader view of the game itself. Nation States is a relatively old game, having been released back in about 2002. What do you rate the health of the game overall?
I'm primarily focused on the gameplay community, so I know the roleplay community is always normally. I know the World Assembly has been particularly busy as of late, something which I'm actually a little bit surprised by. But I know gameplay has been feeling stale. I'll never miss an opportunity to advocate for factions, because I think that if not factions, we definitely need some kind of late game for the biggest 20 regions within nation states. And I know that a region like the South Pacific, other Pacific, at least find challenge and new experience in late game like factions. And frankly, those kinds of things aren't going to be implemented with technical changes to the game. So it really does depend upon the admins for the game saying, okay, how can we improve the gameplay experience? Because while raiding and defending is fun, it's going to grow stale at some point, right? If it hasn't.
So, what has the South Pacific done to help improve the health of the game?
Yeah, so a big thing we do is, of course, we're always very involved within the South Pacific. The South Pacific Special Forces have always been a somewhat involved military organization, and I know under their current leadership they've been doing a lot more defender ops, something which I'm glad to see, and I know it definitely helps keep gameplay active. I know our announcement of the PAX Capricorn caused some discussion on the gameplay forums from some members of that community. But South Pacific can do for the game as a whole. By hosting these kinds of large multi-regional festivals, as difficult as they are to put on, they can do a lot of good in helping ensure that we're a more connected and more vibrant community nation states, and really allows us to help, and specifically talking about PacificCon, it allows us to help the feeders be kind of the most vibrant community within the game.
So at this point, we're going to turn to some of the audience questions. Felix asks, how much impact does the Foreign Affairs Ministry have within the South Pacific region?
Yeah, so the South Pacific is very much a culturally focused region. So the impact the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has within the South Pacific isn't the biggest thing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has done in the last about year and a half is when Glenn was retiring as Minister of Foreign Affairs, he gave a farewell address, basically saying it's time we said we were a defender, which really started the push to us a defender. But on the day-to-day within the region, the biggest thing we do to make sure we know what's going on in other regions. So if anyone has a question about what's happening in, say, the West Pacific, our ambassador to the West Pacific is normally able to answer, hey, here's what's going on in the West Pacific these days. Or if, say, there's concerns over an election somewhere, we'll probably have an ambassador already monitoring that situation. So that way, if something does happen, we'll be able to and hopefully provide a course of action that they can agree to. So while our impact isn't much on the day-to-day, when a crisis does occur, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs becomes the cornerstone in our crisis response.
Atley asks, what do you think of the role of realpolitik or pragmatism in foreign affairs?
Yeah, so my foreign affairs policy is twofold. So I think that realpolitik has a role in foreign affairs policy within this game, just insofar as you need to make sure you can turn to, no matter what, even if you don't necessarily ideologically agree with them, right? So the South Pacific and the North Pacific the North Pacific is not a defender region, right? But the South Pacific and the North Pacific have a great friendship together. And that's probably a great example of that kind of pragmatism because we're both really, really large regions. And us being friends is better off for both of us than it would for the two of us to be opposed, if that makes any sense. But I do have to note that as a defender, morality does play a role. And we still don't have any kind of normalized relations with Balder for ideological reasons, simply because the government of Balder isn't willing to extend into their region. So we don't have normalized relations with. So it's twofold, right? So pragmatism does have a role. Remember, what are the morals your region stands? During the East Pacific coup that just happened, the South Pacific was anti-coups for a number of reasons. One, our treaty obligations, which are kind of the pragmatic reason, but also we believe in democracy as a region. So of course we were going to oppose that coup due to our democratic traditions.
All right. Rose Pierre asks, given the recent conclusion of a special election to determine the South Pacific's next Minister of Military Affairs, do you feel as though the South Pacific Special Forces benefits from having a newer, fresher face stepping into the role?
Heli leaving was a shame, and it was for reasons outside of his control. So we don't fault him at all for that, just to be clear. But I know that Warrior has provided a lot of great leadership to the South Pacific Special Forces. And I've been really excited about what they've done so far, and I look forward to see what they do with about the month we have left in our term. So I'm really glad that they've taken on that leadership responsibility. I don't necessarily, that's kind of the way I look at it, is I think the South Pacific Special Forces has benefited from their, and I'm really glad to see what Warrior has been doing within the Special Forces. But to be clear, Heli also did a really great job until they almost had to leave. So I don't fault Heli for that at all. I'm just glad to see Warrior doing what he's doing in the Special Forces.
Would you have wanted to see one of the generals assume the position in the wake of Heli's inactivity?
Well, that's dicey for me. In the end, Warrior was the only candidate, I think, who was still on the ballot by the time voting concluded. So I wouldn't know which generals would be running. I don't personally work a lot with the South Pacific Special Forces in terms of. I'm sure any one of the generals probably would have done a great job. Warrior has the mandate from and has been doing an exceptional job at that.
All right, let's talk a little bit about you. What is your nation-state story?
Yeah, so my story in the game, I joined in September of 2015, so hit my 5-year anniversary in a couple of months here, something I'm personally really excited about. The first major event I really remember when I joined was the Highville Pacific. That was kind of my foundational moment. I started a political party within the South Pacific following that, which failed, of course, because political parties don't really work in the South Pacific. There's simply no need with how small our legislature is and how small our voting population is, because it's not exactly like you're mobilizing grassroots support in order to elect people. Because there's just not a lot of grassroots to be organized. I spent some time in Lazarus. The judges Undead Dominion of Lazarus coup occurred. I was on the resistance side of that fight. I was when I was a defender, at least morally. I've never been exactly the militaristic player. I've only done 2 updates in a militaristic, what defenders have stood for in terms of native rule and ensuring that community they wish to be governed, infiltrated by the support the community as is. Following that, I had to take a break from nation states due to some real life concerns for about a year and a half or so. I did a lot of personal stuff, and I came back. Upon coming back, 4 months or so, being in the region, and then I ran for Minister of Foreign Affairs, a role I've had for the last 7, and one I've been really fortunate to get to have, and I really enjoyed serving in this capacity for the region.
Have you found any other communities like nation states?
Yeah, so I don't think I know of a community like nation states, just off the top of my head, where it's just such a vibrant online community. My college band is also a really vibrant community, but it's different. I don't really know of any community that's similar to this one. I think that's unique, and I think it's something that we need to treasure, especially in the South Pacific. I've never been place with such an extraordinary culture, and I'm just glad that we have that and that it's been fostered so well through the years by our citizenry.
College bands are a great community, especially if you come down here to the South. Robes asks, what has been your proudest moment as a South Pacifican? In contrast, has there ever been a time when you were ashamed or disappointed in the direction the region the region was going?
My proudest moment for the region is probably when we adopted the Defender resolution, because it was just kind of a moment of us coming into our own as a region and accepting our identity. And I was really excited to see that. To be clear, personally, my proudest moment was when I was in affairs the first time, because I'd been chair of the assembly back in 20. I resigned from the position when a recall motion was brought, because I knew I shouldn't have stayed in the role. And after that, I was unable to really win office again. So it really humbled me. And so when I finally did win election again, it was an even more humbling experience, because I realized I had the trust of the region again, and I was not going to let them down. And so it really just made me realize how valuable that second chance is. And I'm proud of the South Pacific for giving that to me. In contrast, the most recent time I was disappointed with the direction of the region would be during the Tim Skate scandal. It was just awful for the region to go through and really different. And I think it's really something that I know we're going to try to avoid in the future, just as.
What is the biggest first lesson you would give a new player to nation states?
You're going to probably join some kind of ministry or department or whatever your region may call them really early on. So if you're an ambassador, do your job. If you're a writer, write great pieces. Just show up and do what you can to the best of your ability, and you will be recognized and you will succeed.
Roe ask, if you turn into an evil raider for a day, what military organization would you join?
Obviously, I'm joining the serial coupers, Lone Wolves United. But in all serious, Evil Wolf and I, out of character friendship, we get along really, really well. I would be happy to work with them. So I think that would definitely be a raider organization I would be interested in joining if I abandon all of my beliefs about defenderism and why it's the best system of why it's the best military ideology in the game.
For a new player, can you define raiders and how raids work?
Who don't want you to be able to cover.
You broke up there. Say it again.
Okay. So imagine people who don't want to let you govern your own region. Those are raiders. Raids are when they come in and take over your region and take away your right to self-governance.
If you could bring back one TSPer from the past, who would you bring back and why?
Oh, goodness. I haven't been around long enough to really see that many retirements. But just based on what I know, I'd love to meet Fudge. I know she's supposed to be really, really great, so I'd love to get to meet her and see her in government. But I don't really know who it would be, just because I haven't been around long enough to meet that many people who've ended up retiring.
Recently, the West Pacific has implemented the University of the West Pacific to teach new players avenues of government, military, and more they could be involved in. Does the South Pacific have an educational system like the university for new players?
Yeah, so I need to be really careful what I say about this because there's a lot of TSPers in here. But we do have TSP University, or TSPU, which is kind of fulfills that role, but the South Pacific doesn't have a large integration program, which has been a point of contention in a recent assembly debate. So I'm not going to discuss that any further, just to avoid getting in hot water with the assembly members who are listening to this.
All right, I understand. We're gonna be closing this off soon because we're getting ready to hit our time limit. Is there anything else you would like to add for the audience?
I just want to say thank you to everyone who put in all the hard work to organize PacificCon, and I want to thank the North Pacific Radio for hosting this event, hosting this conversation. It's always a pleasure to get to talk to the broader gameplay community, especially in these kinds of contexts where it's a conversation among. So I just want to thank you all for letting me come on and allow me to spend a couple minutes talking foreign affairs policy with y'all and explain where I come from and where the South Pacific is going.
We appreciate you coming on. We thank our audience for listening in. And if you want to rehash this or relive this experience, this recording will be available on the North Pacific NIMBYS YouTube channel. Thanks again for coming.
Thank y'all, guys.